Good morning to you all. Do you like it when the sky is blue and the sun shines? I sure do. A few weeks ago, I walked into the Library of Congress, where I spent the next several hours with men and women who have suffered. Brought together by a group called the China Aid Society, which works between the U.S. and China to address the longings and the heartaches and the tragedies and the troubles of people who love God, who live in China, who find themselves under oppression and persecution because of the systemic, long, historic, still remaining communist government in China. And the people here that I know, part of the U.S. Effort in this China Aid Society, gathered together people from China, but also people from the U.S., especially Capitol Hill. And they were people who were committed to thinking through what might be done on the face of the earth to bring about aid for folks in China. Why was I part of it? Well, maybe 15 years ago, one day in my office, I had a telephone call from a woman at the State Department, and she was the China specialist. She said, "Steve, could you come to spend an evening with a group of heroes in China?" She called them the Václav Havels of China. You don't need to know much about him, but he was a Czechoslovakian patriot, a poet, a playwright, who became president eventually. And these she called the Václav Havels of China, who wouldn't be able to return to China until things changed politically. She called them the Tiananmen Square survivors, who now live across North America and have a question they want to ask. So about 3 weeks later, I, with my wife, went hill and dale out into Virginia, and we spent an evening with these people who mostly were between 25 and 35, I would suppose, maybe about 30 of them, scattered from Vancouver and Berkeley on the West Coast all the way up to Boston on the East Coast. And we had a dinner together, Chinese dinner together, sat around a big fireplace talking for the next number of hours. And they told one by one the stories of their own suffering. They had been in Tiananmen Square, which at this point is almost ancient history for people who weren't born before '89. But in 1989, the communist world was imploding all over, especially, of course, in Europe, where this was dominant. Russia, Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, Romania. Big question was, what would happen in China? Would it happen in China too? And we all watched that spring of '89, wondering what happened in China. And slowly, students began to make their way, students like you, 20-year-olds from across China, into the great, great city of Beijing, to the great, great public square called Tiananmen, and to raise a question to the Chinese people and to the government: can we please talk to you about the future of China? And they began to camp out there, and water bottles brought in, and food brought in, and by the hundreds and then thousands, people like you, 20-year-olds, began to find their way into this great, great square in the middle of Beijing. And then on this very tragic night in June of that summer, the tanks rolled in, and God alone knows how many were killed that night. But those who I spent the evening with that evening were the survivors, were the heroes, were the leaders of the Tiananmen protest who made it out eventually, who didn't die. And they had a question they wanted to ask, and the question was this: you see, we have suffered, but we love China. We love China. We love China. I heard that language again and again, those words. We love China. We love China. We want to be part of its future somehow, someday. We might have to suffer in doing that. We might be imprisoned. We would even die to do that. But you see, we want a good reason that makes sense of a choice like that. We've been asking philosophers all over the world, do you have a good answer to this question? We have not found an answer that satisfies us yet. And we're here tonight because we have a question for you, and it is this: does Christianity have a better answer? Does Christianity have a better answer? That is, of course, the question behind the very existence of a university like John Brown, isn't it? Most of 100 years ago, those who loved this school into being made a wager on learning, setting forth a vision of both life and learning that is founded in the Christian faith. And over the generations and decades, you have committed yourselves again and again to the belief that the gospel of the kingdom is true to the way the world really is, Not one narrative of life under the sun among many competing narratives, but true to the world that is really there. Not because we're smarter people, surely not because we have any reasons for arrogance, because we don't. We've not earned anything here, not ever. But by grace, we've been given reasons to believe that can make sense of life and the world, of our very secularizing, our very pluralizing, our very globalizing world. If that isn't true, brothers and sisters, what are we doing here anyway? Well, we only have a few minutes, actually, and I've got, not much time with you. But I want to take up two questions. What are we doing here? And then what next? What are we doing here? And then what next? The challenge of our age, we could spend hours on this, couldn't we? We could walk one by one, row by row across this auditorium and say, well, what do you think the big question of the world is today in the year 2017? Is there a challenge? Is there a challenge that faces all of us as human beings who live in this year, in this world? And it probably would be some good answers, and I don't think there's one answer that has to be given. But for today, I'm going to put it this way. There's one challenge that seems to me to dominate the life in the world as we know it in the early 21st century, and it's this, that we're offered an answer to life, and it's summed up in the word simply karma. Karma. Karma, 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 of every kind, for everyone, everywhere. You may not like U2's music, and I realize that the 20-year-olds among you probably even resent still that they stepped into your own, iPhones a couple of years ago and dared to put their album onto your iPhone without you being asked about it, and you hate them forever, ever after, actually. But there are others of you who may think, it wasn't that bad, actually, and they still are the biggest band in the world, 30, 40 years later. When they move from concert to concert, which they'll do again this summer, it takes about 200-plus semi-trucks to move them from one city to the other. When they put out a concert tour, like they did a month or so ago, within 10 minutes, every seat in the world is taken. They're still a big deal making music all over the world, and you may or may not like them. I happen to like them a lot, actually. But in a song that was sung some years ago, they have these lyrics, you're stuck in a moment you can't get out of. You got stuck in a moment, and you can't get out of it. You got stuck in a moment, and you can't get out of it. Well, what's karma? Simply it is, you got stuck in a moment, and you can't get out of it. And it's easy to think about pantheism, about Hinduism and Buddhism and varieties of ways of thinking in the East, which we say, yes, they teach karma, don't they? And we get that, and I understand that. I've been in that part of the world, and maybe you have too, and you understand that people think that way, they live that way, because it happened, and it happens, and it happens, and you can't really choose against it because it will happen. That's your karma after all. But if we call it karma, looking at India and other places in the East, in America, in the West, we don't call it karma typically. We call it evolutionary determinism. We call it materialism. But you see, philosophically, I would say, it's really the very same thing, isn't it? When we say in the West, as we do in the universities of Arkansas and California and Kansas and Virginia, officially the intellectual ethos of the academy of the world in the West right now, what is taught? Well, what's taught is that we are our DNA. First and last, we are, in fact, our DNA. And you may imagine a choice, that you get a choice, but our better philosophers of biology, at least the ones making the most waves, like B.F. Skinner a generation ago or E.O. Wilson of this generation, as Skinner put it, we're beyond freedom and dignity after all. We are beyond freedom and dignity after all. Let's stop talking about those outdated ideas. They no longer make sense of our life in the world, in the very modern world in which we live. E.O. Wilson, Consilience, the Harvard biologist of this generation, he simply says, we are our DNA. And you see, if that's it, brothers and sisters, if that is, in fact, the way it is, it's not really different than what Hinduism and India teaches today. They call it karma. We use other language, other words to get at the very same idea. It is, I would say, the challenge of our age. Well, you may not like you too, but maybe you like Mumford and Sons instead. If we had more time, we could play some of this song called Timshel. But Timshel comes out of the Hebrew Scriptures, and particularly in the 20th century, we're reminded of it in the book by John Steinbeck called East of Eden, where the word Timshel actually is the word of the book from beginning to end. It's a whole 600-page meditation on this Hebrew idea, Timshel. What's the word? Thou mayest. Thou mayest. Thou mayest. You get to make choices after all. You get to make choices after all. And the heart of Steinbeck's novel, East of Eden, is looking at life in the 20th century in California, but of course, looking at life in the modern world and saying, in fact, at the very heart of the human heart is we get to make choices. Timshel is true. Thou mayest, after all. You're not stuck in any moment you can't get out of. How does Mumford and Sons play it? Well, they say, in fact, that Timshel, it's our ladder to the stars, after all. It is our dignity, after all, to be people who have responsibility, the ability to respond. Thousands of singers and songwriters the world over, musically and artfully, muse over the meaning of life, don't they? Of who we are and why we are, of what we do and how we do it. One of my own teachers on this question was a woman who was born in France in the early 20th century. Simone Weil is how she would have said her name to us. Simone Weil. Born into a Jewish family in Paris. At age 10, she told her parents, "I am a communist." You need to know that at age 10. For the next 10 years, she lived that way as best she could as an emerging adolescent. Went off to the Sorbonne to do philosophy. Was the top of her class 3 or 4 years later. Never having met a communist yet, that summer Trotsky, the great communist visionary, came to Paris. She couldn't believe that Trotsky himself was going to come to Paris. She planned for it and spent the day with him in the evening, listening to him talk all day and night, and then walked away from communism the next morning as she walked away from Paris, literally, and said, "I no longer am. I care about people who suffer," and he doesn't. He cares about humanity, but doesn't really care about people, and that's different for us. It's a longer story. We could talk more about it if you'd like. But along the way, she spent her life the next 10 years among the sufferers and the groaners of France. She came surprisingly, by surprising grace, into the presence of the one she called the God who has tears. The God who has tears. Now, she may not have been hired eventually to teach at JBU, but I would say that she had an honest encounter with the God of the Scriptures, with Jesus. She wrote an essay along the way, which I think ought to be mandatory for places like John Brown University. And it has an awkwardly long title, so get ready for it. It's called Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God. Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God. It's not a very sexy title, is it? But it's a good essay, and you ought to read it. You could download it tonight and read it before you went to bed. At the heart of her essay is this. She argues that when studies are done right, we find our way, surprisingly, into what she calls a sacramental learning. A sacramental learning. We begin to see where heaven and earth touch each other in the study of history, of biology and astronomy and the arts and politics and economics, because it becomes sacramental in that sense. She roots this in the story we call the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan. Out of the Gospels, you know the story very, very, very well. If I just asked you to close your eyes and tell us a story, you could do it. I'm sure you could, really. But you know how it begins. An expert in the law asked Jesus a question, which isn't an honest question. It's really a play question. It's a question somehow to, make its way into the academic discourses of universities, whatever age they're in. Where'd you go to school, Jesus? Who are your teachers? What kind of degree do you have anyway, Jesus? Jesus won't play the game with him, but finally he says, I'll tell you a story instead. And we know the story, we call it the Good Samaritan. And Simone Weil roots her story, her own image of sacramental learning, of the right use of school studies with a view to the love of God in this story. Because you see, it's about an expert in the law, somebody who had in Walker Percy's inimitable image, who'd gotten all A's, but who flunked life. Who'd gotten all A's, but who'd flunked life, actually. So here's somebody who knew all the law of God, every letter of the law, but had missed the point, the meaning of the law. The two religious leaders, much like the expert in the law, walk by this battered man on the road to Jericho. They don't see a neighbor, do they? That's the problem. They have no eyes to see a neighbor. For historical and sociological and political and theological reasons, they did not see a neighbor. Simone Weil's right. It's true, actually. That we have to have somehow a heart that allows us to see things that really are. And when we do, we're opened up to the possibility of what she called beautifully sacramental learning. What's this mean for you, for me? To see as God sees, to hear as God hears, to feel as God feels. Into the very stuff of your studies, the details, yes, but the range and the depth of your studies, the complexity of every discipline, of every area of study. Not my faith and history, not my faith and biology and politics, my faith and sociology, my faith and business or economics or engineering, but instead learning to see into my study in history and sociology and biology and engineering and English, with the eyes of my heart open to what it is about, to what its questions are, to why it matters to God and to the world, to my own responsibility to the study itself and to God and to the world. So it's not Christianity and zoology, or Christianity and education, or Christianity and the arts, but in and through my deepest convictions about reality, working and working again to understand the meaning of zoology, the meaning of education, the meaning of the arts. It's learning to see seamlessly, to understand the integral character of the world, of our particular responsibility in and for the world. It's learning to see the coherence of all things, things in heaven and things on earth. Because it is that, it's learning to study sacramentally, which is the way that Simone Weil argued it, urging us to see every discipline, every field of study, as God sees it, as it is to be seen. It's learning to learn because we're learning to see, to hear, to feel, because we are attentive to the way the world really is, attentive to who we really are. If Simone Weil argues that the very heart of the Good Samaritan's ability to see his neighbor was that he learned to pay attention, and those are her words, to pay attention. You see, brothers and sisters, at the heart of your being a John Brown University student is your own sense of calling, of vocation into the work of learning to pay attention to what's really there in the world. That only happens when we pay attention to who God really is. Well, what next? What next? I could tell you stories of a lot of John Brown University graduates that I've known over the years. They actually have threaded their way through my life for the years of my life. I've chosen just one, though, right now. Maybe later today we could talk about some more who are major parts of who I am. But one is a younger friend, and he came here 10 or so, 15 years ago, from the Philippines by way of the Faroe Islands, which are a little bit of islands north of Denmark in Scandinavia. Ben Rasmussen was his name. Maybe some of you remember him, coming here with a big head of hair and a big beard, and finding a girl from a ranch in Wyoming, and over the course of walks into the night and nights in the library and dinners and breakfasts together and vacations with parents and grandparents, and deciding when it was all said and done at JBU, they were going to get married together. So from the Faroe Islands to the Philippines to Siloam Springs, it's really almost 1 million miles away, isn't it, really? Ben married into a JBU family, interestingly, the Kirkbride family. Kirkbride's from Chugwater, Wyoming, but Pam had come here from a big wheat farm in southeastern Wyoming as an undergraduate 40-some years ago, and she spent her years there, and she married a rancher from Wyoming, the guy named Dan Kirkbride, and they spent the next years of life in Chugwater and raising cattle, and a couple of little girls, Abby and Hannah, and who both were students here along the way. Pam, by sad heartaches in this life, didn't live very long. When the third baby was to be born, she had a cancer that just ravaged her body, just broke out everywhere in every way. And many of us who were friends to the family cried and grieved and mourned and hoped and cried and grieved and hoped again. But eventually Pam died of cancer, and two little girls, and Abby and Hannah were these little girls. And they both came to JBU along the way in their mother's memory and honor. And so one day, my wife and I drove over a hill looking into Cheyenne, Wyoming. There was a double rainbow, actually, over the whole city of Cheyenne. And who was to be married that afternoon but Ben and Abby? Seemed appropriate, a double rainbow for that beautiful day. Ben learned to take photos here at J. John Brown University. He was a digital arts major, I think is how you call them here. And he began taking pictures and more pictures and more pictures. And along the way, he photographed two of the weddings of my children, actually. But he became a photographer whose work was beginning to be seen all over the country and then eventually all over the world. Ben, the photographer, yes, that's Ben's work. There. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, maybe now, I had a call from Ben one day. And he said, "Steve, I'm going to be at a national photography gathering in a few weeks. I've got some friends who are going to all get a house together in the city where this is going to be. We're just going to spend a few days talking about our photos, what we're doing with our lives and our work. And would you talk to us? I know you think about vocation, but how about the vocation of photography?" You see, Ben's work is learning to see the world through the lens of a camera, trying to tell the truth about what he sees and what it means. He's a remarkably gifted photographer, actually. His work finds its way into the magazine racks of your life, actually, in reality, into the major newspapers of our day. And several years ago, he was leading this group of people who were coming from all over the country to think about the work of photography itself. And his question to me, can you talk to some of my friends about the vocation of photography? He asked if I would enter in, talking with his colleagues about their craft and art as a vocation. What might that look like? What might it mean to see one's work as a calling? Does it make any difference at all? What's it mean to see in a way that implicates the seer and the ones who see, the photographer and those who see the world through his lens? As we talked, one of those on the call, because it was a telephone conversation together, said this to me: "I'm intrigued by the idea that photography could be about deepening a kind of responsibility between the viewer and the viewed, especially that it could be a responsibility marked by love," which was my argument to them that day. The vocation isn't just a word in the abstract. It isn't just what I do. It isn't just the work that is mine. It is that, but it's more than that if it's going to be a vocation, dear brothers and sisters. It has to be seen as a responsibility marked by love. Whether the work is as a photographer, whether it's as a cattle rancher, whether it's as a businessman, whether it's as a butcher, baker, candlestick maker, it has to be seen as a responsibility marked by love. Well, you see, I see it that way. I do. Because the truest vocations are always exploring developing relationships and deepening responsibility, whatever our calling is, wherever our callings take us. What habits of heart are required if we're going to see ourselves as implicated, for love's sake, in the way the world is and ought to be? Because you see, that's the word, isn't it, today? To see ourselves as implicated, not to see ourselves as in the abstract. Yes, I love God and I love God's world. But see, the problem with the man who'd gotten all A's in God and God's law was he couldn't identify a neighbor. He couldn't see a neighbor. That was the problem. And the two religious leaders who walked by this neighbor on the road didn't see a neighbor. And the Samaritan, surprisingly, saw a neighbor. And you see, Ben, my friend, in his years here, began to learn to see the world as God sees the world. And in and through the technology of fancy pants cameras, which he has out the wazoo, really. His ability and his heart is somehow to allow us to see the world in and through the photos he takes, to see our relationship to the world, our responsibility to the world. You see, it's to see with the heart, to see in a way that requires responsibility, to see in such a way that I'm connected to what I see. Like the Samaritan before him, he has eyes to see his neighbors. Not only is it his work after work, his vocation after work, as if somehow vocation is really something we do beyond and outside of the world of work. No, in the very work of my friend Ben's life, not serving and loving God after 5, when my work is done, not as an avocation, but in fact as a vocation. In a strange way, my life has been full, as I said at the beginning, of John Brown University graduates. Each one important to me, each one someone who has formed my life, each one someone like Ben who's learned to learn about things that matter while a student here. Somebody who's learned to see as God sees. Each one someone who has learned to pay attention to things that matter, to the world that is really there, to the questions and the concerns that connects heaven to earth. It's what the first John Brown once described as the very real things of life. Yet, each is someone who sees vocation as integral, not incidental, to the mission of God in the world. Having a hard time keeping up with these photos, aren't I, here? Each of these friends, JBU grads, each one, someone who sees vocation as integral, not incidental, to the mission of God, to the very work of God in the world. It's what my own teachers once put it as, to see life intrinsically, not extrinsically. Because you see, intrinsically is to see it, in fact, as it's woven into the very meaning of, it's woven into the very existence of. It's not my, as I said, my faith and my politics, as if somehow, clearly I'm a Baptist, a Methodist, a Catholic, a Presbyterian, I'm a Democrat too, Republican too. It isn't as if somehow, yes, of course I believe in Jesus, but you see, business is business after all. Economics is economics after all. I live with that all over my life, day after day. Because you see, we have a disposition to dualism as the people of God in the world. We want to be like that in some strange way. We choose to be that in some strange way. To say, well, yes, of course, I do believe, like that expert in the law, but to miss the very point of what we believe. Not to pay attention to the very meaning of what we believe. Intrinsic, not extrinsic. That kind of life begins in a place like this, where we learn to see seamlessly, because we've learned to see sacramentally, seeing where heaven and earth touch. Everything does matter. Studies matter, but so does sexuality. Belief matters, but so does behavior. My personal preferences matter, but so do my public judgments. What I do when people are watching matters, but so does what I do when people aren't watching, too. Everything matters. At the end of my morning at the Library of Congress a few weeks ago, a young woman from the State Department came up to me, explaining her work in protecting human beings from abuses and injustices, especially in China and in the Far East. She's seen some of the world, and she knows some of its wounds. And then she cried. She said there was something about the words I spoke that day, the images and ideas that she'd heard, that made her think that her work was important, that in fact it mattered. It's very hard. It's very hard. It's very hard to keep at things that matter. The world, the flesh, and the devil conspire against us, insidiously so, perniciously so, whispering all day long, "Oh, come on now." You don't really believe that, do you? Whether we're students called to care about what we learn and how we learn and why we learn, or whether we are State Department specialists in human rights, the challenge is to keep on keeping on, to have eyes that see our place in God's world and to understand our place in it. She asked if we could talk some more, wanting to hear more, wanting to know more. I'm sure we will. Amen.